It's great that you're here with us. And it's a particular honour to host Professor Smith, who is a global expert in child development and particularly anti-bullying interventions. So childhood bullying is a problem that can have a long-lasting impact on an individual's life. As you all probably know, the ILD is committed to raising the profile of childhood bullying as an issue and to researching how to alleviate its impact and working on future solutions, particularly in the area of cyberbullying. Within the ILD, Claire Monks, who just introduced me, has convened a roundtable of experts from education, academia, policymaking and practice who've been working together for the past year to bring together research and practice to better understand bullying and to create solutions for educators and parents to use on the ground. So thank you for all those who are here today who have been part of that initiative. So it's great to welcome a global expert in this field to talk to you today. Professor Peter Smith is at the Unit for School and Family Studies at Goldsmiths, which he headed from 1998 to 2011. He's an emeritus professor who continues with his research, writing and international collaborations. He's a fellow of the British Psychological Society, the Association of Psychological Sciences and the Academy of Social Sciences. In 2015, he was awarded the William Thierry Prayer Award for Excellence in Research in Human Development by the European Society of Developmental Psychology. And in 2018, the Student Wellbeing and Prevention of Violence Award from Flinders University in Australia. He's written and edited books on child development, adolescence, and understanding child bullying. And this public lecture is an important part of our the ILDs and universities anti-bullying week activities. So I hope that you all enjoy being here, and I hope you all contribute to the discussions that we have. And so, Peter, I'll hand over to you to give us your lecture. Thank you. Pleasure.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Vice Chancellor, for your welcome, and Claire too. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a privilege to be here. Great work you're doing here in Greenwich, I think, on the topic of school bullying. This will be a fairly easy listening kind of talk, I think, so you can just relax and sit back. It'll be a bit of a cook's tour of actually what schools might be doing about bullying. That's what's manifested in the policy. So I'm going to talk about a content analysis of school anti-bullying policies in England and suggest some signs of progress. By myself, Ifra Kidwai was my colleague in this. I did invite her to this meeting, but unfortunately she couldn't come. So the background to this. Schools in England are legally required to have some anti-bullying policy, some written document that's available to young people themselves, parents, teachers, anyone else in the school community. And previous research has found that the scope and quality of these policies is very varied. And I did some work with colleagues, first of all, 2008. This was some schools in Leicestershire, actually. And then we did a follow-up some years later, 2012. And then together with Noel Purdy, a colleague in Northern Ireland, we did a study of the anti-bullying policies in Northern Ireland as well. That was gathered, the data was gathered in 2012. So that was some years ago. So it's time to look at, again now at what these policies are like in schools in England. So we aim to analyse anti-bullying policies from a wide sample of schools in England to look at the strengths and weaknesses in coverage. What are they good at covering? What are they not so good at covering? We would get data from these policies from primary and secondary schools, so we could obviously compare primary and secondary. And to some extent, we could make a comparison with findings from the earlier studies, when, for example, data was gathered in 2008. Bearing in mind that different schools, so it's not a perfect comparison, but it gives a sort of indication really of whether these policies are getting better in terms of their coverage or not. Also, as it happened with this data set we got this time round, we got scores for bullying, victimisation and perpetration. I'll say more about that in a moment. So we can see whether the policy score, that is the coverage in these policies, how good they were, does that correlate with bullying victim rates? For example, you might think in schools with good policies that cover a lot of ground, bullying victim rates might be lower. You know, one possible hypothesis. Anyway, we'll see whether that's true or not. So what we did, we got anti-bullying policies from 200 schools in 2022, so a couple of years ago. And as I said, IFRA was great help here actually getting the policies. Most of them are on school websites, and they should be accessible through the school website, but sometimes they're not. So she sometimes had to contact, you know, the senior management in the school and say, look, you know, you're legally required to have an anti-bullying policy, where is it? Generally speaking, they found them, you know, so she got them. That's from 136 primary schools and 64 secondary schools. And these were schools that were taking part in the Anti-Bullying Alliance United Against Bullying programme. That's a programme they've been running for some years. Suzanne here has been working on the analysis of data from that. And included in that are data on bullying victim rates, basically, from the pupils. So that's how we got that data. It was there anyway, through the Anti-Bullying Alliance. Now, when we looked at the policies, we used a coding scheme. Do these policies include various criteria? We'll go through all these shortly. We used the same sort of scheme that we'd used in the earlier publications, and in particularly, the most recent one was the Purdy and Smith one in Northern Ireland in 2016. And as I mentioned, we had the pupil self-report data on experiences of bullying, victimisation and perpetration, not on all the schools, but most of them. Now, when we were scoring the policies, we were looking at these four main areas. With altogether 42 items. The 42 items were scored on a yes-no basis. Does the policy have this or not? And the 15 items on the definition of bullying behaviour. I'll show you all these shortly, so you know, don't worry about that. There are 11 items on reporting and responding to bullying incidents. There's 9 items on recording bullying and communicating and evaluating the policy. And the 7 items on strategies for preventing bullying. So those are the 4 main areas and 42 items that we looked at. When we got the policies, we just looked to see how long they were. And the mean number of pages for the policies was 9.5, around about 10. So normally, you know, you print it off and you've got this little paper document, maybe about 8 or 10 pages, a range from 1 to 35. That's a big range. And some had just 1 or 2 page policies. Now we got 42 items, if you remember. I think it was 42. Yeah, 42 items. So, you know, we've only got 1 or 2 pages. You're not going to be covering all 42 of those. They're too short. On the other hand, if they're much longer than 10 pages, well, how accessible are these going to be? They tend to have much unnecessary material and risk compromising the requirement that it should be clearly communicated and understood by pupils, parents and staff. Now, that's a quote from the Department for Education website, where it says, you know, schools must have a policy, and these should be clearly communicated and understood by pupils, parents and staff. Well, if it's 35 pages long, I can tell you I had to wade through some of these 35-page policies, and they're not that, you know, easy to take in, really. Now, out of the 42 items in the scoring sheet, on average, about 26 items were scored as present, which is 62%. And we looked at what we got in the earlier studies. In 2002, it was 40% of items were scored. In 2008, it was 49%. In 2012, this is in Northern Ireland schools, it was 52%. So, and now it's 62% in the study we just did. So it's been going up monotonically. That's where you know, you could take that as being, well, thank goodness it's going up rather than going down, you know. But it's going in the right direction. But as you know, the scoring sheets differed slightly, and the actual areas in which schools were surveyed differed as well. So they're not the same schools being compared from time to time. So there's obviously a limitation, but at least there's promising signs there that coverage is increasing. Now let's look at what was actually found in the studies we looked at then. This is the 100 schools. And first of all, the definition of bullying, which had 15 items. And what you see here on the left-hand column, well, first of all, you see the actual item itself here that we asked about. Does the policy have a definition of bullying, for example? And then over here, you see the percentage of policies which had yes. And that's our scoring, of course. I did this with IFA. We looked through the policies and scored them. We got into observer inter-rater agreements and so on, which were good and so forth. And then does the definition make it clear that bullying is different from other kinds of aggressive behaviour? And power imbalance is a crucial way there of distinguishing bullying from just the odd fight or quarrel, which is not usually taken as bullying. 58% of policies, only 58% if I had that. So this is the percentage of policies where it was yes, and we put green and market green as well as reasonably high, as it were, over, I think it was over 90%. You've got green marks there. So most policies had a definition of bullying. As you'd expect, they start off saying, we don't want bullying in the school. By bullying, we mean an acceptable definition. Just over half made it clear it's different from other kinds of aggressive behaviour in some way. Almost all policies mentioned physical bullying. Almost all policies mentioned verbal or emotional bullying, like threats and nasty teasing. Almost all mentioned relational bullying too, like social exclusion. The great majority mentioned things like hiding or damaging belongings or extortions. Almost all mentioned cyberbullying. A lot mentioned homophobic bullying. By the way, we'll see later on when we look at the comparison from earlier studies, that's an improvement. Definitely an improvement. 76% mentioned transphobic bullying. Should I press admit here? Where
I've got that down.
Will you? Oh, good.
Yeah.
This is obscuring some of the figures here. 88% mentioned racist bullying or harassment. 88% mentioned sexual and sexist bullying or harassment. Yeah, can we get rid of that? Thanks. Thank you. And then we got 77% mentioning bullying due to special educational needs and disabilities. 74% mentioned bullying because of faith, religion, or belief. Only 33%, now red is a low, means a low score here. I think it was below 50%. Only 33% mentioned not only pupil-pupil bullying, which the others have been about, but also mentioned the possibility of adult bullying, adult pupil bullying, like teacher-pupil bullying, or vice versa, pupil-teacher bullying. Now, these are sensitive topics, but, they're forms of bullying. They do happen in schools, they happen. I would have thought a good whole school policy would say we're not accepting any kind of bullying, whether it's pupil-pupil or adult pupil or pupil-adult, But only 33% of policies mentioned that. 56% mentioned the issue of bullying on the way to school or happening outside school. That's a bit low, actually, because schools do have the power to work with pupils where bullying is happening, on the way to and from school, for example. So that's the findings on definition. So as it said on the left, most items were present in the majority of school policies. General types are generally well covered, but not the adult teacher-pupil bullying, which wasn't. That's the red one there. Now, it's not going forward for some reason. Thanks. Okay, so the next section is about reporting and responding to bullying incidents. Section B. But let's start at the top. States what victims or targets of bullying should do. What should you do if you've been bullied? For example, tell a teacher, and it should clearly apply to victims or pupils who experience bullying. About 56%, about half of policies said what victims should do, clearly. Say how teaching staff should respond to reported bullying, which is a crucial part of a school policy. Really. What should you do if you get involved? If you're a victim, what you should do. If you see it happening, what you should do. If you're a teacher, what you should do. Say how teaching staff should respond to types of bullying, specifically mention bullying, and not just deal promptly. Some policies just said teachers should deal promptly with bullying when it happens. Well, sure, but how? So we were looking for more than just deal promptly. Well, on that criterion, it's only 64%. Clearly mention the responsibilities of other school staff. We were talking about this in the round table earlier, of course. Teaching assistants, lunchtime supervisors, and so on, if they know of bullying. Only 10% policies mention that specifically. Some say all staff should do this. So what does all staff mean? It should be made clear, you know, this can include the lunchtime supervisors, the teaching assistants and so on. So if you, if you apply that strict criterion to it, only 10% of policies that really do that. Clearly mention the responsibilities of parents if they know of bullying. About half of policies say that. Clearly mention the responsibilities of pupil bystanders if they know of bullying. About half of policies do that. State whether the approach used for bullying will depend on type or severity of incident. It should be clear that the approach or sanctions apply to bullying behaviour, 42%. Mention follow-up to see whether the approach or sanctions were effective, 63%. Because if you take some action about bullying, it's important to do a follow-up. You know, did your sanction, whatever it was, work? 63% of policies mention that. Discuss what action will be taken if the bullying persists. Okay, you do your follow-up, it's still going on, what do you do? Only 40% of policies said that. Now, we talked about dealing with the bullying. What about suggesting how to support the victim or target of bullying? More than just, we will support victims. Quite a lot of policies said, we will support victims. Fine, but how? How are you going to do that? And only 60% gave an indication that they would support victims in some specific way, counselling, support, whatever. Suggest how to help the pupils doing the bullying to change their behaviour. That's another interesting one. What are you going to do with the children who are persistently bullying? Apart from sanctions. Okay, there are going to be sanctions. Anything else? Are you going to try and help them change their behaviour? More than just, we will support. We will support children who take part in bullying. What about how? What are you going to do? Only 21% of policies gave any indication of that. Discuss if, when or how parents will be informed. 91% do say that. So looking at the left-hand side, Section B items were mostly scored in around half of the policies, but with two noticeably low scores. Those are the ones in red, of course, here. Only 10% mentioned the responsibilities of other school staff. Only 21% really talked about how you would help pupils doing the bullying to change their behaviour. Section C is about recording bullying and communicating and evaluating the policy. Will reports of bullying be recorded? Most schools, 93% policies say yes. Say who's responsible for coordinating the recording system, about 40%. Show how records or survey data will be used to know whether the policy is working or not, about half. Clearly mention periodic review and updating of the policy. Most policies do say that. Clearly mention consultation with parents about the policy, only 35%. Clearly mention consultation with pupils about the policy, only 36%. Mention the role of the school governors, 84%. Reference the Equality Act 2010, about half. And mention alignment with other relevant policies, like safeguarding and behaviour policies, about 82%. Now, when we get these numbers, you might be thinking, how trustworthy are they? So, for example, let's look at one about consultation with pupils. Number 6, clearly mention consultation with pupils about the policy. Do they actually do that? And the policy might say, we will consult pupils about the policy. Do they actually do it? My feeling is probably they are. Because if they're not, and if some observant pupil or even their parent perhaps is reading this, because the policy should be widely available, and if they're not being consulted, they should be saying, oi, oi, you're saying you consult people, but you didn't consult me. In other words, pupils and parents have leverage on the school if the policy says that something is happening, and it should happen. Alternatively, it could happen that it wasn't mentioned in the policy, even though it was happening. That would be a bit surprising, though, because you'd think it's a positive thing. There's no motivation really for the school to say to omit mentioning that if it's actually happening. But my feeling is probably on the whole, these are reasonably reliable sorts of indications of whether the action is happening or not. Now, strategies for preventing bullying. Number 1, mention any of encouraging cooperative behaviour, rewarding good behaviour, improving school climate, creating a safe environment, 99%. Pretty much all the policies are saying that. We encourage a cooperative environment, we encourage a safe school climate, blah, blah, blah. So that's an easy one for them to score. Discuss general issues of peer support, ways of pupils helping victims or targets. Beyond B5, out with B5. The responsibilities of pupil bystanders. So more than just the responsibilities of pupil bystanders, but more about peer support beyond that, 38%. Discuss specific powers and or strategies to deal with cyberbullying. Now we know cyberbullying is a bit different from traditional bullying. Any specific ways, e-education, so forth. Only 16% saying that. Discuss specific powers or strategies to deal with out-of-school bullying, not cyber, but out-of-school bullying. Only 23%, even though schools have power to do this. Give advice for parents about bullying. Beyond B4. B4 is mentioning the responsibilities of parents what to do, like tell the school. So only 20% give further advice to parents. Mention the preventative role of playground activities or lunchtime supervisors, 37%. And discuss issues of inclusiveness, such as support for non-English speakers, people with learning difficulties, vulnerable people, only 33%. So looking at the left-hand side, this section actually had the lowest scores, apart from B1, which all schools scored on pretty much. Almost all schools' policies mentioned encouraging cooperative behaviour, rewarding good behaviour, etc. But other items were only present in the minority of policies, particularly those scores for discussing the powers to deal with cyberbullying and out-of-school bullying and giving advice to parents about bullying. Okay, so let's run through all those items and those categories. We compared primary and secondary schools. They didn't differ on the total content score. But we looked at individual items and found 8 differences on individual items between the primary and secondary. Pretty much what you'd expect. Primary school policies are more likely to include C5, that's consultation with parents. Primary schools smaller, perhaps easier for them to have, closer contact with parents. More on the role of school governors, more on the role of playground supervisors, particularly important in primary schools. All arguably more salient in smaller schools and with younger pupils. Secondary school policies are more likely to include homophobic bullying, understandably perhaps, bullying outside school, what victims of bullying should do, reference to the Equality Act, and powers to deal with out-of-school bullying, which might be seen mostly as more relevant in the secondary centre. So no big surprises there. Then we compared scores in 2008 and 2022, 2022 being the current ones, 2008 being the previous one in England. Different samples, so it's, limitation there. 34 items in common in the scoring sheet, and we looked at those. Marked increases in definition, notably in mentioning cyberbullying. Well, that's not surprising, of course, because cyberbullying has become that much more noticeable and prevalent in recent years, and that's been picked up in the school policies. Also, an increase in types of bias-based bullying, like homophobic, as I mentioned, sexual disabilities, and faith. They're much more common now in policies than they were, 20 years ago. An increase in mentioning adult or teacher bullying, or vice versa, but from a low baseline. There's still very few policies doing that, although it was an increase in the minuscule number of policies that mentioned it in the earlier survey. Section B, changes are relatively small. An increase in mentioning follow-up to see whether sanctions were effective, but a decrease in mentioning grading of sanctions or helping people doing the bullying to change their behaviour. Section C, an improvement in coverage for stating that reports would be recorded and how the data will be used. And for section D, an increase in coverage for issues of inclusiveness and for mentioning bullying on the way to or outside school, however, a decrease in covering advice to parents about bullying. Now, we also, as I mentioned, we got data on victim and bully rates for many of the schools. And we've got the policy scores, which is the total number of items which scored yes on those 42. So we looked at correlations between the policy scores and the self-reported bullying, victimisation and perpetration scores across 131 schools. Out of our total sample, 131 schools, we had all this data. So here are the correlations. The policy score. Have you ever been a victim of bullying? Have you been a frequent victim? Have you ever taken part in bullying others? Ever a victim frequent? Ever been a bully of others and frequently been bullying others? Well, the red correlations are kind of what we might expect in a way, knowing how these scores of being a victim or bullying work. They tend to correlate amongst each other. If obviously, if you're a frequent victim, that's going to correlate highly with ever being a victim. That's not surprising at this point. What might be more surprising is the bully scores also correlate quite highly with the victim scores. But that actually is not an uncommon finding in this kind of work. Quite a few children seem to be involved both as victims and as bullies. The bully victims, sometimes, as we call them. And that's what's coming out here with these red correlations. There's quite a lot of children involved, basically, in either being or both being a victim or bully. Now, what's interesting are the green correlations. These are the correlations with the policy scores. Now, the naive hypothesis would be a good policy score should mean a lower bullying victim rate. In other words, we'd expect perhaps a strong negative correlation. Right? We've actually got a weak negative correlation, a very weak negative correlation. Now, negative correlation is in the right direction. It does mean higher policy scores mean lower victim and bully rates, but only slightly. The effect size is pretty low. So, in line with our previous literature, we've got these high correlations between the bullies and victims. Mainly interested in the green correlations. Correlations are very small, don't even reach statistical significance, in fact, indicating a very small impact of the policy on these behavioural measures. Or, what it might mean is many other factors affect bullying victim rates beyond the policy, which is what I would take it to mean. Lots of factors affect bullying victim rates, and the kind of range of content in the school policy might be one small factor in this, but a lot of other factors too. But my gut feeling is that the school policy is still important, because the school policy provides that framework for action and for anyone to look at the policy, any stakeholder, pupil, teacher, parent, and so on, to look at the policy and use it as leverage if they've got an issue with the school about bullying or victimisation. So, a summary. Some overall improvement in policy coverages since 2002 and 2008. There's been some discussion of the issue, I think, in the literature and amongst some practitioners too, and modest evidence for things getting a bit better that way. But there's some clear weaknesses, even recently, in the coverage of policies from the 200 schools we looked at. Firstly, they focus on pupil-pupil bullying, but rather few policies mention adult-teacher or teacher-pupil or pupil-teacher bullying. And that's, I think, a pity, because if you want a whole school policy and a good school climate, it's got to tackle these issues as well. And then another one, again, many policies don't mention the responsibilities of other school staff, the teaching assistants, the lunchtime supervisors and so on, if they know bullying. That's really important, but they're falling short in many cases there. Another low score was on how to help pupils doing the bullying to change their behaviour, apart from sanctions. Many policies lay out sanctions, which is what the Department for Education wants, by the way. The Department for Education says there should be negative sanctions against anyone taking part in bullying. The policies often pick that up, and negative sanctions would be perhaps, you're banned from the playground for a week, or certain privileges are revoked. There's a stern talk with the head teacher and so forth. But there's not so much on talking with the bullying children, if you like, a more counselling or therapeutic kind of approach. Why are they doing this? Can they change their behaviour in some more positive way? That doesn't seem to be suggested much in many of the policies. Rather few mention consultation with parents about the policy or consultation with pupils about the policy. Rather few discuss specific powers to deal with cyberbullying, or those schools have that, and similarly for out-of-school bullying. And the advice to parents about bullying is rather minuscule, it seems. Well, implications for practice. We've got to be implications for practice, I think, to the round table. So it may be useful, we think, for schools to review their policies in line with the revised 42-item scoring scheme and in light of the findings reported here. So they could run through those 42 items and, and they could score their own policy against those 42 items and also reflect on the findings I've reported, which are published, so they've got access to them, and perhaps review their policies in that way. Educational psychologists might encourage schools by pointing out the suggested policy improvements over time, while also focusing on common areas of development needed, notably, ones I've mentioned before, mentioning the responsibilities of other school staff, suggested ways to help the people doing the bullying to change their behaviour, giving advice to parents about bullying, and being explicit about the specific powers they have to deal with cyberbullying and out-of-school bullying. Those are all areas that we identified as somewhat low. An educational psychologist working with a school might pick up on those and discuss those with them. And also encouraging students and parents as well could be useful. Also in evaluating the length and availability and intelligibility of policy documents. These DOS policies should be easily available and, as we saw from that DFE quote, easily accessible to pupils as well as parents. And some are, but some are, well, more doubtful, I would say. So thank you for listening. The findings are published, as I mentioned, in a journal called Educational Psychology and Practice, which we felt was the right journal to publish it in because that's what we read by educational psychologists and other similar people involved in working with schools in this sort of area. And if anyone would like a copy, you can just email me. That's my email there on the left, p.smith@gold.ac.uk, and I can send you a copy of this report. And some thanks there for people, including Suzanne, you're here. And some other people too who helped with gathering the data and with commenting on the scoring sheet and so forth. That's it. Yeah, thank you.
Very much, Peter. No, don't run away.
No,
So I just wondered if anyone in the room had any questions for Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. That was really interesting, and I was interested in the correlations that you showed. You showed a weak negative correlation. I was wondering whether one explanation might be that maybe schools that have a lot of bullying then develop quite a strong policy that has a high score, and so that's working in the opposite direction, isn't it? So
say it again.
So maybe I wonder whether some schools that have a high level of bullying are they more likely to develop a strong policy
I see.
that then has a beneficial effect, but you've got a negative effect and a positive effect in relation to, or a negative and positive correlation over at the same time.
Well, it's an interesting idea. Yes.
I mean, you don't need, I guess,
I don't know how you would test that, really.
have some longitudinal data.
Yeah, you need longitudinal data on you, yes. That's fine. Yeah.
One of the possible options, sorry, just jumping in, one of the possible options is we did evaluate. So schools that participate are rewarded for their participation in the United Against Bullying programme. And they either receive a certificate, a bronze award, a silver award or a gold award. Some of the latest data we've looked at is specifically at those schools that have got silver and gold awards, and maybe that's a later sort of paper to examine the differences between maybe bronze schools and that. And
I think if I did look at the difference between gold and silver schools, we found not much difference. Actually.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering about, I think it was toward the beginning, about the schools that didn't actually have a behavioural, didn't have a specific bullying policy, even though these were ones being evaluated by the ABA. And I was thinking, is that because a lot of schools were kind of classing bullying behaviour under a general behaviour policy, and sort of it was kind of encompassed within that.
Yeah. So legal requirement to have some kind of anti-bullying policy, but it can be a separate policy, which many schools have, or it can be embedded in a broader sort of safeguarding or behavioural policy.
Yeah.
So of course that was fine if we can get out the behavioural policy into that.
So this.
Yeah.
Hi, yes, thanks, Peter. Really interesting. I was interested in the scoring scheme. I know clearly it's based on the earlier papers, but it's been revived over time. But how did the team, the research team, come up with those scoring items to decide that these are the things that should be in a policy if it's good standard?
Okay. Well, what I can tell you best about is how we worked. We took the earlier policies and then we revised it for this current work. And what we did was consult a number of people. We consulted Noel Purdy, who had been the instigator of the previous study in Northern Ireland. We consulted Martha Evans, who was the head of the Anti-Bullying Alliance. And we consulted other colleagues. I'm trying to think now who, but we consulted a number of people anyway. Yeah, and it went through a few iterations. So, yeah.
I can imagine that schools would actually find that probably really helpful, you know, knowing the kind of criteria that make a good policy, because although they're told that they're supposed to have a policy, often the amount of guidance they get as to what to include. So I'm just thinking that's a really useful implication coming out from this, because schools could self-evaluate, couldn't they? And use some of this suggested criteria to review their policy.
That was part of the implications I think that we had here, wasn't it? Yeah, but much earlier we did talk with the DfE about this and whether there should be guidance for schools in how to use their policy. And they were not very keen on that. They felt it's really up to schools what they put in their policy, and we shouldn't be too big brotherish, if you like, in terms of them to be in it. So that's the situation for now. The ABA does have some guidance on its website, so this does help with it.
Other ways of getting support for schools,
And certainly in Leicestershire, the educational psychology team there, who were co-authors on the earlier papers, they have been working with schools on this this year. Yes, they also advised on revision 2 of the Leicestershire College as well, if you like.
Don't think we've got any questions in the chat yet, but if anyone is online and would like to ask a question, do feel free to post in the chat. We do have Joe monitoring the chat at the moment, so anyone else got anything they'd like to ask?
Were you surprised by any of those results?
Well, was I surprised?
Yeah, were you surprised? Anything kind of jump out at you?
Well, I wasn't surprised at the primary secondary differences. I wasn't surprised at most of the changes at a time. Perhaps a little bit surprised still at the very low scores for some of the things like the non-teaching staff, you know, sometimes supervisors and so on. But I thought that should have been higher by now. But no, not greatly surprised, no.
What about the adult teacher?
Well, that was another one, but yeah.
Because what struck me when I looked at that was that perhaps they don't want to put it into a policy because it makes it look like it's a problem they have to deal with.
Yes.
So I'm wondering.
Sure, well, it's a sensitive topic, isn't it? Yeah, here it is at the 33% one, I think. Yeah. Well, it's been quite difficult to do research on that too. Yeah, because many schools will let you in to study pupil bullying. They're ready to admit that can happen.
Yeah.
If you say we'd like to see how often teachers bully pupils.
Yeah, that's a big issue to deal with.
Yeah, not so easy.
In terms of employment.
Absolutely.
It's really, we have those.
Or pupil-teacher bullying can happen. Or, of course, teacher-teacher bullying, like workplace bullying.
Yeah, but it struck me as well, and that hasn't come up
But it hasn't come up in the policies very much.
But again, you don't really want to possibly let out a culture of bullying be known in the world. Raise suspicion that it might be there.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I've got a slightly different question. I wanted to ask if in your experience you come across schools that just basically refuse to comply with their responsibilities legally or ethically. In a sense, refuse to protect children who are being bullied, for example, or refuse to have policies that would accurately kind of help to identify it. Or maybe that information is really hard to get at.
Hard to get at, I think, yeah. Certainly a variety in terms of the kind of responses you get from schools, you know. Some schools are obviously great, you know, and doing all the things that they're required to do and so forth. And others, it's more like pulling teeth, as it were. You've got to really work hard even to get the policy from them. And then the issue is the policy implemented. So not an easy question to answer, really.
Okay, thank you.
Joe,
Sorry, I've got a question in the chat from Kay saying, I was previously a trustee of, I'm guessing, our school. Did you have any issues with engagement or people being oblivious to bullying? I met head teachers emphatically deny that any bullying took place at their school.
Yeah, well, that wasn't really part of our study here in terms of looking at the policies. But I would say, going back, thinking of my history of working with schools, which goes back to the 1970s. If you go back to the 1970s, yes, definitely came across schools which denied any bullying was happening. This, when I was working in Sheffield, and we're doing the Sheffield project, and we worked with 24 schools. And some schools will just say, no, there's no bullying here. We know there might be one up the road, it might be happening, but we don't have it here. And a sea change happened through the 1970s and into the 1980s, I would say, through the publication of research reports showing how prevalent bullying was, pretty much in every school in a way. And also perhaps to some extent normalising it in the sense that, it's not shameful to admit that there are a few cases of bullying in your school because it happens everywhere. So later on, most schools were not saying there's no bullying here, rather they were saying, well, we don't want bullying, it might happen occasionally, but if it does happen, here's our policy, this is how we're dealing with it. So I think there have been some good changes over the decades, really, since the 1970s in that.
Rachel, did you?
I'm sorry, no, I was thinking of the one. I was just going to come back to the support staff issue. When you mentioned about that being a sort of surprising finding, and it was surprising to me because it feels a little bit like, not full circle, but I remember when there was the explosion of interest in bullying in the research in the 90s, and there was a real focus on support staff as well as teachers. There was a lot that there was research looking at those groups, and school communities now are so, I think there's so much more complexity in who is staff. We've got many more different roles in schools alongside teachers. So I was quite surprised that wasn't more reflected in the policies. It feels a bit of a shame, because in order for schools to function now, it's not just teachers, it's TAs, different types of TAs, there's ELSAs, there's volunteers, there's lunchtime staff, there's so many different people. So yeah, I think it suggests to me that needs to kind of come back onto the table, because we were talking about today in the round table about support staff and what we mean by support staff. So it feels like a bit of a gap, doesn't it?
It is, but actually you're right, that's perhaps the most surprising finding and the most dismaying kind of finding in our set, really.
Yeah.
More questions? Anybody online, Joe? Okay. All right. Well, I just want to take this opportunity to thank Peter again for his presentation and for joining us at the round table and for Anti-Bullying Week. And thank everyone for being here in person and online. So thank you very much. Thank you.
We've had a lovely conversation between Claire and Peter, and led into a podcast about his work, which is really informative. It's really lovely because Claire is Peter's PhD student. So if any of you want to see it, if you drop us a line, we'll send it out to you.
Yeah. Looking in the room, there are drinks, refreshments, and looks like maybe little cakes as well as wine. So please go and help yourself.